Greetings and welcome to the official first podcast of Spring Semester 2015. And this newest of new podcast for the semester is going to chat about a major shift that's happened in the world just this semester. And it's a Saudi shift to Salman. Salman, what? That would be one King Salman, because we have to say Adios to Abdullah and Salaam to new King Salman, the newest of new kings of Saudi Arabia. Because for the first time ever in World Leader Death Watch history, in the very first week of classes, we had to put a strike on the board because King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia passed away on January 23rd of 2015. At the ripe old age of 90 or 91. I've seen conflicting reports on that. I guess when you're born almost a century ago, they don't have as good of records. So 90 or 91 years old, King Abdullah was when he passed away of unspecified sickness. When you get that old, you could pretty much die of anything. And he was in power in Saudi Arabia for the better part of the last 2 decades. He officially did not take the throne until, I believe, August 1st of 2005. So you'd be like, well, he's only been the full head honcho king of Saudi Arabia since 2005. Yeah, kinda. But he actually was in real power in Saudi Arabia for the entire decade before that, from 1995, when the then King Fahd suffered a serious stroke and was incapacitated. So King Abdullah was... He wasn't officially the king of Saudi Arabia from 1995 to 2005, but he was truly in charge. And then he was truly in charge in 2005 for the next decade. So this major world figure, and whoever is the king of Saudi Arabia is a major world figure, no matter who the actual person is. And what do I mean by that? Well, because whoever's in charge of Saudi Arabia is almost invariably one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful men. And yes, I'm not being sexist. Men. Saudi Arabia is a very conservative society. We'll get to that in a little bit. And women can't even vote yet, much less be the head of it. So whoever's in charge of Saudi Arabia is one of the world's wealthiest men, one of the most powerful men, is in control of 1/5 of the world's known oil reserves. And is also the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the holiest sites for a major world religion, that being Islam. So, and by the way, Saudi Arabia is a huge U.S. Team West ally. So whoever's in charge of Saudi Arabia is a very, very powerful human and someone to know. Now, again, for the last 20 years, it's been King Abdullah, but he just passed away, and so now we have King Salman. So this podcast is about... Let's reminisce a bit about what was so awesome about King Abdullah, and say a few things about the new King Salman, and then speculate about what shifts may be occurring in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East because of this shift in power. Now, let me preface this before we even get to Abdullah. If you're looking at the internal dynamic of Saudi Arabia, one of the world's most conservative states on planet Earth, and that's not a positive or negative attribute, I'm just saying it is. When you move from one leader to another, quite frankly, there's not going to be a whole lot of change. They strive for continuity, and it's a monarchy, so it's a royal family. There's no voting involved, and the royal family sets this up well in advance. They know the lineage of who's next in line decades before that person actually gets up there. So again, from the outset of this podcast, we're not going to expect a whole lot of changes just because a guy died and a new guy took his place. It's pretty much, let's meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But let's meet those bosses now, shall we? And again, we'll finish up talking mostly about what might the repercussions be of new leadership. Because although I said there's going to be continuity, new people always do things at least a little slightly different. And times are changing fast in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in particular, so there's going to be change. Okay, let's get back to King Abdullah. By all accounts, awesome dude. And for those of you that know me, I gotta be honest, I'm not a huge fan of monarchy. I'm sorry, I grew up here in the West. We like liberal democracy. We like individual rights. We like being able to pick our leaders. It seems like the proper thing for us. So monarchy, of course, is the antithesis of that. And we here in the Americas had a good old-fashioned revolution to kick the crap out of some monarchs and throw them back across the Atlantic into Great Britain. So we are not, as a general rule, really kind of pro-monarchy. Myself, personally, not a big fan of monarchy. Having said that, monarchies are awesome if you have a really good king in charge. And by all standards and definitions, King Abdullah was a really good king. Again, the side note here is, and this is the one to write down, folks, monarchies, hell, even dictatorships, they can be run very efficiently and very awesomely if a very good person is in charge. The problem with them is, what happens when a bad person gets in charge? And the answer is nothing, because the bad person has all the power and you can't do anything to get the bad person out of there. So back to King Abdullah, a really good king, even an anti-monarchist like myself will be the first to admit that in the 20 years of King Abdullah's rule, Saudi Arabia has really jumped way ahead, economically, socially, even a little bit. And they have become a regional powerhouse, something that I would not have necessarily said 2 decades ago. Now again, does King Abdullah have detractors and enemies? Sure. Does the whole House of Saud, that's the royal family, do they have detractors and enemies? Sure. I'm not suggesting they are faultless or even hugely great people, but King Abdullah himself, yeah, he was pretty good. Even though he's one of the wealthiest men on planet Earth, he kind of lived a very normal life, a very ascetic life. He did not go for the pomp and circumstances. Of course, his office, he's a king, there was some pomp and circumstance, but he lived fairly simply. He actually cut the salary of all of the princes and princedoms and dukes, whatever their system is over there. There's a whole lot of the royal family, and they all pretty much just get money for being alive. And at one point, he cut their salary and said, yeah, you guys need to work harder and do more for the people of Saudi Arabia, and you don't need all this money. You don't do anything. And people are like, what? The royal family was anyway. That's just a little bit of insight into Abdullah's personality. Some have even said that he was kind of a reformer. Maybe he was a liberal reformer that was trying to open up Saudi society some and get it kind of more geared towards the modern world. I'd be willing to agree with that too. I think Abdullah was a semi-reformer, but yeah, hang on. He was about as much a reformer as anybody could be in one of the most conservative societies on planet Earth. Because Saudi Arabia is the birthplace and holiest sites of Islam. It is a very religious society. It's a very conservative society, and the priestly class, the clerical class, has a lot of power within the society, and that clerical priestly class wants to keep it as conservative as humanly possible. And so in that context, did King Abdullah reform Saudi Arabia and make it all equal and fair and open and a liberal democracy? Hell no, not even close. But he did pretty good given the circumstances. I'm just going to list off some things that Abdullah did in his 20-year tenure in the top slot of this very powerful country. Economically, he probably did the most, meaning that Saudi Arabia, obviously, very reliant on oil. It's pretty much the entire national budget. It is oil. That's what they do. You've never had any other Saudi Arabian products besides oil and natural gas. However, they have a growing and younger population, and so the problem with just making tons of money off of oil is it doesn't provide that many jobs. And so you have 20, 30, 40 million people who are sitting around getting free health care and free schooling and free everything because the state's rich. But what do they do? What do you do for a living? And unemployment has historically been pretty high in Saudi Arabia, and that's a bad scene to have a bunch of young, predominantly men, be overeducated and underemployed. So under Abdullah's reign, he encouraged private entrepreneurship, private enterprise, privatizing a lot of industry that the state used to control, not the oil industry. Saudi Arabia still controls and owns its oil industry, its #1 revenue source. But he encouraged foreign investment and entrepreneurship to try to create much needed jobs. And again, they're much needed. You do not want a society in which a whole bunch of people are unemployed hanging out. It's just not good. On top of that, he established job training programs to help ease the severe unemployment and underemployment among the educated Saudi youth. And I'm going to say this now, I'm going to kind of come back to it. He actually established a scholarship program to send young Saudis abroad to the entire world to be educated. Hold that thought for a second, we'll come back. You may know some of these people right here on campus. He also developed the long-wasted natural gas industry in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia's had so much great oil, they've pretty much not cared about anything else. And so he was like, hey, wait a minute, we actually are underutilizing all this natural gas, which is a byproduct of oil drilling in some spots. So they did that. He actually even increased or created a solar energy industry. This guy's awesome. He was awesome. He's passed away now. You might think, a solar energy? Why on earth would the country that has the most oil reserves on planet Earth need solar energy? Well, because he's smart. He's trying to diversify their economy, and a big chunk of Saudi Arabia's wonderful sun-baked sand that gets intense sun rays all the time. Hey, what better place to have a solar industry than that exact spot? And so it also diversifies, it uses educated people, it creates new technologies. So he pushed really hard for all these economic diversification to help his country, and was quite successful in a lot of that for the last 2 decades. Socially, how liberal of a reformer was King Abdullah? Well, again, this is a conservative society. I've said it 10 times now, but he was a very powerful figure, not just because he had this powerful office. He was an outspoken person, well-educated, well-disciplined, well-spoken person that did not shy away from stating his opinions about things. So socially, as a reformer, he contested Al-Qaeda's militant interpretations of Islam vehemently his whole life. He said, any interpretation of Islam that says you need to go blow people up is wrong. I don't buy it. And again, this is from a religiously conservative place where some clerics within the Saudi system might actually agree to terrorism or think it's okay to defend Islam, even if it means terrorist acts. King Abdullah did not. He publicly many times said no. He actually ordered the Saudi textbook be purged of the most extreme language, which would perhaps incite or encourage radical behavior in Islam. He had hundreds, maybe thousands of militants arrested, and some of them beheaded within Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah really was one of the foremost fighters against terrorism in Saudi Arabia. Little known fact, jot this down in your head, most Americans have forgotten. Al-Qaeda, that group that bin Laden dude we all know and hate, and now he's dead and we're happy about that guy being dead. Al-Qaeda's original mission was to take out the leadership of Saudi Arabia, not attack America. Al-Qaeda is, again, a radical Islamic group that says, yes, the royal house is preposterous. The whole royal House of Saud, which controls the Holy Lands, they're friends with the United States, and they're evil, and we don't like them, and who put them in charge anyway? And we want a theocracy in Saudi Arabia, so we want to kill all the Sauds. So in that position, it wasn't much of a thinking point for the Saudi royal family to be like, no, we don't like Al-Qaeda. We're going to do everything we can to fight Al-Qaeda. And Saudi Arabia did that the entire time King Abdullah was in charge, and again arrested and beheaded lots of folks within Saudi Arabia for hatching militant plans, and abroad as well. They pushed that fight out to other parts of the Middle East. More on that in a second. Being a pretty liberal reformer type of guy, again, kind of liberal reformer type of guy, King Abdullah was the first head of Saudi Arabia to meet with the Pope. He actually pushed for religious, cross-disciplinary religious interchange and exchange and peaceful coexistence type stuff. So he met the Pope. On a more hawkish front, he sent, and this is most recently, sent Saudi fighters, jet pilots and fighters to help the United States bomb ISIS. So ISIS, another radical Islamic group, King Abdullah said, no, those guys don't represent Islam either, and so we're actually going to physically help take the fight to those folks as well. On more domestic social policy, Abdullah appointed a woman as a deputy minister, first time that ever happened, encouraged women to enter the workforce, made it more acceptable for women to enter the workforce, built a huge $12 billion university, which women can attend and take classes alongside of men, although I think the classrooms may be separate. Don't quote me on that, but I think the women's physics class is over here and the men's physics class is over there. And even talked about perhaps letting women drive. Oh my! How radical! What a reformer! Now, I don't think that ever happened. I think the religious clergy kind of pushed back on some of this stuff, and so I don't think the women being allowed to drive ever occurred. It's a hotly contested issue in Saudi Arabia, by the way, right up to this day. And as I've already pointed out, Saudi women can't really vote. Now, again, this is a monarchy, so there's not a whole hell of a lot to vote for. But they do vote for kind of local elections, and I guess it's kind of a parliamentary system where they have representation, but it's a monarchy, so you're not voting for the king. But in either case, women ain't voting for nobody no ways. And they ain't driving to the polls to vote either. So let me come back to the seed I planted earlier, which was King Abdullah did all these things and perhaps reformed or opened up Saudi society a bit. But I think the biggest legacy he had was that scholarship program that I referenced 5 minutes ago. And that is that, and he set it up, Abdullah did, to send Saudi students out of high school, I guess, or in college, to go study abroad in universities all over the world, mostly in the West, to be quite frank, mostly in Europe and the United States, to study technical, skilled stuff. So no matter what university you're in the United States, I'd be willing to bet a few bucks that there's at least one person from Saudi Arabia on your campus, and they're probably studying engineering or some sort of science, or actually, yeah, that's probably all they're studying. Anything technical science related, and engineering. And why would I say that's perhaps his biggest legacy? Oh, before I get to the legacy part. So the awesome thing about this is these Saudi students go all over the world, and it's all paid for by the Saudi Arabian government, 100%. Tuition's covered, their living expenses are covered, they actually get money, they get an allowance. So if you ever meet Saudi students abroad, go party with them, because they're there for free. It's awesome. Now, I think they have to go back home and work in Saudi Arabia, maybe even work for the government or work for a government industry like Aramco, the local oil industry. But it's all free. It's awesome. They get money to go to school somewhere else. Man, I think the Saudis got it right. I think higher ed should all be free, and people should be paid to go to school and work hard. And, if you don't get good grades, well then, boop, you pull that and you have to go work for a living. But if you keep learning and getting better, and that's how you build a great society, is get people educated. But now I'm getting all fired up. Let me stop about there. It's an awesome program, though, and it's probably his greatest legacy and greatest reform type thing that King Abdullah would have pulled off. But of course, it's not going to happen in his lifetime. It truly is like planting seeds. Why would I suggest it's the biggest legacy? Because now you have hundreds, if not thousands and thousands and thousands of Saudis who have spent time over in Europe and America and maybe China and maybe other parts of the world, who have experienced liberal democracy and open societies and being able to drive cars if you're a woman. And all of a sudden, you get back home and you think, wait, I love Saudi Arabia, I'm from here, but we should be like those other places. King Abdullah's a genius. So he's got all these young, professional, motivated people who are probably more pro-Western than they were before they went west, who come back home. You're planting seeds for reform and change decades, generations ahead of yourself. So, genius move by King Abdullah. I really like that. It was awesome. Now, let me back it up and tell you what he didn't do. So he reformed some of these things, but when it comes to political reform, no. Saudi Arabia is politically a monarchy. The people don't have a choice in who is the head honcho and the decisions that those head honchos make. This is an old school monarchy with a very powerful clerical class, which shapes and, I won't say manipulates, but constrains the monarchy to do the things they want to do. This is really like the old school way that it was in Europe for thousands of years, a couple thousand years, where the religious, the clerical establishment, they weren't in power per se. The Pope wasn't in charge of France or Spain, but they have tremendous influence over the kings and queens of France and Spain. And you have that same old school mentality happening in Saudi Arabia. The Islamic clerics aren't in charge, but boy, the monarchy has to kind of salute them and to not do what they say, but if the clergy says, well, we don't favor women driving and we're going to put a lot of pressure on you, the monarchy, to not pass that, then that's kind of the way it works. Does that make sense? And again, that's the way it was for monarchies all over the world, a very close relationship between church and state that still exists in Saudi Arabia. And the King Abdullah, even though he was wildly popular, beloved, spent billions and maybe trillions of dollars providing services and reform to the economy and society of Saudi Arabia. He's beloved by virtually all Saudis. He couldn't change things politically. That's going to be for another group of people. Maybe those students he's been sending abroad all these years in the future. All right? So, let me finish up here with King Abdullah. Overall, wildly popular. Every Saudi I've ever talked to was like, yes, everybody loves the king. Everybody loves the king. We're not so sure about the next king, but everybody loves Abdullah. Straight up, legit, not corrupt guy, fairly balanced in his approach. He built up Saudi society internally, diversified their economy, really pushed education, and made Saudi Arabia into a much more powerful entity, not domestically, but within the region, and that's going to come back to some other stuff I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. Hugely important figure for his country, hugely important figure for the Middle East, the region, hugely important figure for Islam, a world religion, and of course affected world events. Everything you've ever heard about the Middle East, every single story, including all the wars that the United States has been involved in the Middle East, the Saudi king has played a significant role in what's been going on with all that. So, important guy, popular guy, will be missed. I think overall, for 2 decades of his reign, a positive balance sheet. And again, I'm not even a huge fan of monarchy, but he would, by all rights, be called a good king. He was a good king. He didn't do anything that bad. Yes, there's political dissent. Yes, he helped squash some of that political dissent. But overall, on the balance sheet, a big positive for Saudi society for 2 decades, and he will be missed. I'm looking at the clock here, and I see that I've already spent 22 minutes talking about King Abdullah. So let's make this a two-parter. This first part now was on King Abdullah. Now let's shift to the new boss, King Salman, and talk about why he's perhaps just slightly different, the important things that he may be doing, and the bigger impacts on the region that this Saudi shift may facilitate. New king, new style, new ways, new impacts. So we'll stop here for now and then pick up with a part 2 in just a moment.